A Mochi Moment from Sadie, who writes, I'm not crying, you're crying. This is what I said during my first appointment with my physician at Mochi, because I didn't have to convince him I needed a GLP-1. He understood, and I felt supported, not judged. I came for the weight loss and stayed for the empathy. Thanks, Sadie. I'm Myra Ahmed, founder of Mochi Health. To find your Mochi Moment, visit joinmochi.com.
Sadie is a Mochi member compensated for her story.
Hi, I'm Mike Pesca, host of The Gist, and I'm the kind of person, maybe you are too, who likes to step outside the easy reinforcement of my own ideas. Maybe you actually like to have your beliefs tested and your perspectives expanded. I find that exciting, not unsettling. There are a lot of shows, ideologically driven shows and networks whose audiences say, thank you for telling me I'm not crazy. But I don't really doubt my own sanity. I don't need affirmation and reassurance that my side or one side of the political or social debate is right. I'm more worried about being misinformed by lazily going along with the untested assumption or narrative. The Gist is for people who know that being interesting starts with being interested. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, everyone. Patrick here, cutting in before yet another one of our interview episodes that we like to do every so often. This week, I had the absolute pleasure of talking to Christine Estima about her debut novel, Letters to Kafka. So a little bit on Christine. She is the author of the short story collection, The Syrian Ladies Benevolent Society, but she's also written for the New York Times, Vice, the Globe and Mail, as well as the CBC. Some of her writing has actually been recognized with awards or shortlisted for awards. So her short story, Your Hands Are Blessed, was included in the Best Canadian Stories 2023. But she was shortlisted as well for the 2018 Alan Slate Prize for Journalism. And Christine was also a finalist for the 2023 Lee Smith Novel Prize. So like I said, I absolutely loved this interview. Christine was very generous with her time, and I absolutely encourage people to pick up Letters to Kafka. I will stop rambling and actually let people listen to what Christine has to say about the book and that whole process behind it, because she can say it a lot better than I can. Enjoy the show.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
So I'm here with Christine Estima to talk about her latest novel, her first novel, I should say, Letters to Kafka. So first of all, Christine, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And for listeners who might not be aware of what Letters to Kafka is, do you mind giving us a brief overview of what the novel actually entails?
Sure. So as most people know, Franz Kafka was a famous author in the early part of the 20th century. Even though he was born and raised in Prague, he famously only wrote in German. And so the very first person to ever translate his works from German into Czech, so his own people could read him, was a woman, and her name was Milena Jesenská. And it was in writing to Kafka to ask if she could translate his works that they struck up this epistolary love affair. And it is known that they met twice for two lovers' trysts. But it's not really known what happened on those trysts. You know, he doesn't really mention it in his diaries, and she doesn't really mention it in her letters to other people. And then Kafka died in 1924 from complications of tuberculosis. And after he passed, Milena was instrumental in fighting the rise of fascism in Europe. She hid Jews and dissidents in her home. She helped people escape over the border. She contributed to banned publications denouncing the Nazi occupiers. And for that, she was arrested by the Gestapo in 1939, and she died in a concentration camp in 1944. After she passed, Kafka's letters to her were published in a very famous book in the 1950s called Letters to Milena. But her letters to him, we don't know what happened to them. They've been lost to time. So in my book, I imagine what her letters to him might have said, and I imagine what might have happened on those two trysts. And the book is called Letters to Kafka. It kind of works in concert with Letters to Milena, but you don't have to have read Letters to Milena to appreciate the book.
Having not read Letters to Milena, I can fully agree with that one.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful book. I should say that from the start. I really enjoyed
Oh,
it.
did you like it?
I absolutely loved it.
Did you? Oh, that's lovely to
I
hear. Thank you.
It's one of those rare books that I read and I immediately consider it as something that I could teach. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. No, I'm not even exaggerating. I'm not saying that just because you're there in front of me. I genuinely would imagine myself teaching this in like a contemporary literature class. Yeah.
Oh, that's so kind. Thank you so much. It's strange because the book like just dropped. And so because it's so new, I don't really know yet how it's landing and how it's landing with readers. And so it's really great, like at this early stage to hear that like, oh no, it's landing, like people appreciate it. So thank you so much. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, I think part of it, and this is something that I had a question for later, but we can pick it up at any point. I think the fact that it is in conversation with so many genres and styles, and of course, other authors, is so indicative of its power as a text on its own, right? And that's what really personally drew me to it. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Thank you. I love that.
So you actually, from what I understood, encountered Milena through a journalism fellowship. Right? So can you take us a little bit through that whole process of how you went from one project to the Milena project that turned into the novel itself?
Sure. Yeah. So it was 12 years ago. Actually, I think it was almost 12 years ago to the month. I think it was like September 2013. And I was living in Europe. I'm a European citizen as well. I'm like dual Canadian European citizen. And I was totally broke. And I found out that there was a fellowship offered by a university in Vienna. And it was for European journalists to fund their work. And the fellowship was called the Milena Jesenská Fellowship for Journalists. So I applied for it. But I remember after I sent in the application, I was like, well, who is Milena? Like, I'd never heard of her. You know what I mean? And so, I did a Google search and, I came across like a sparsely populated Wikipedia page. But still, I wasn't satisfied. I don't know what it was. There was something where I was just like, this isn't enough. Like, I need to know more. So I looked to see if there were any books I could find, either written by her or about her. And almost everything I found was only written in German or in Czech. But I was able to find 5 books that had been translated into English. And so I bought all 5. And when I was done reading these books, I was just, as the kids might say, my flabbers were gasted. You know what I mean? Like, I was like, what an incredible woman. What an incredible life. Like, what an incredible story. What an incredible adventure. And also, what a shame that I had never heard of her. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, I think we're seeing more and more that so many incredible women, their accomplishments have been attributed to men, or they're simply remembered as a footnote because of the men that they loved, And so I remember thinking to myself, someone should write a novel about her. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, I'm someone.
Yeah.
And really that was it. Like that, I just kind of like hit the ground running after that, And I think it kind of, we're seeing a lot of literature that is quite like this, in the idea that we're no longer just remembering women as the lovers of famous men. Like these women have their own stories. So I'm thinking of novels like The Paris Wife by Paula McLean, which retells Hadley Hemingway's story, not Ernest Hemingway's story. And then there's also Zed, the story of Zelda Fitzgerald, rather than F. Scott. And there's a new book that was just made into a movie here at TIFF, and it's called Hamnet, and it's about Anne Hathaway rather than Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And so I think my book kind of falls in that tradition where it's like these women shouldn't just be remembered because they loved a famous man. These women have their own incredible stories that deserve to be shared.
Absolutely. And I was thinking as well as I was reading that it also seems to fit in with the epistolary genre, which you brought up earlier, right? And I'm wondering, this is a question I had for later, but I'll ask it now. I'm wondering to what extent you chose to kind of channel that history and that style in a conscious manner, because it was often a style that women historically used as well to often discuss things that they couldn't out in public necessarily, or in even private conversations in their lives, right? So I'm
Absolutely,
wondering how
yeah.
that changed. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been a big fan of the epistolary. Like, I mean, and just in like my own life as well. Like, I am famous for collecting old love letters from European flea markets. I was actually profiled in the Toronto Star and also Toronto Life just from my love letter collection.
Oh, that's awesome.
So as and those things are really important to me because I've always found that I don't know, letter writing, I think it's a form of communication that we're slowly losing. Now communication is so disposable. Like you can shoot off an email or a text message in a couple seconds, and you don't have to really think about the language that you're employing.
Mhm.
And back then though, during 100 years ago when Milena and Kafka were writing to each other, or during the Great War or the Second World War, or sometimes letters would take weeks,
Yeah,
if not months to arrive. And so you couldn't just, send a message like you up, or DTF, like, you know what I mean? You had to really think about the
sure.
language that you're employing and the sentiment that you want to express because you never knew when you were going to hear from this person again. So people were writing on both sides of the page, up the margin, on the back of the envelope.
Hmm. Hmm.
I've collected letters that have like lipstick kisses on them
Oh, that's
and
cool.
like Victorian letters that have been sprayed with like perfumes and scents. I
Hmm.
have letters sent during the Nazi occupation of several countries that have swastikas
Yeah.
stamped on them, or like a thing on the back that said it was opened by the Nazi censors and read before it was delivered, things like that. So
Hmm. Hmm.
it's a form of communication that is also very tactile, and I try to describe it in the novel as such because it's a letter writing because it's tactile, because you actually have to like scratch
Yeah.
your sentiment into the page. You have to lick the envelope and the stamp, but it's like something that the other person on the receiving end, they get a piece of you in that sense. And so I try to describe it as such that it's very intimate. And I think that we don't really communicate like that anymore. So I really wanted to carry on that tradition. And so I kind of made like a big study of it. But my whole life, I think, has been a study of the epistolary.
No, but you're absolutely right. And I noticed that in my own life where, I have some friends that I've known since high school, right? So for too long, for my own life, for not necessarily too, but it's been a long time, and I don't want to say that number out loud. Um, so, and yet I recently have written them letters for various reasons, and really uncovered a level to our relationships that I never would have expressed otherwise, right? So I
Hmm.
absolutely understand what you're saying there. It's really an interesting way of putting it,
Yeah.
and it's something that I really think is conveyed, I guess, in the writing of letters to Kafka, where there seems to be a very personal feeling to the novel, right? And I
Yeah.
think both in the letter segments that you're mentioning, but also in the way that you describe certain areas or certain spaces. I think, is it too much to say that there's quite a bit of you in the novel, despite it being ostensibly a novel about Milena, or is that
Um,
pushing it a little bit too far?
I don't know. I mean, I would say that like I mean, I would argue that the any author will tell you that if you want to know anything about them, just read their books,
Yes,
because even if the story is not like this is not my personal story, it's
of
not
course.
about me, but anything that I find interesting, themes I find interesting, drama and conflict that I find interesting, issues that I find interesting, they're all there.
Yeah.
I'm my body of work is almost exclusively concerned with the voices of women and the narratives of women and women's sexuality, women's boundaries, women's voices, women's agency, women's volition, and also how society has quite often robbed us of those things or told us that they don't exist to begin with. And so I think this book follows in that tradition of other things that I've written. So yeah, it's me in that sense. But I think that while I am absolutely fascinated with Milena's story, her and I are not the same, although we do share some of the same characteristics.
Of course, of course. Um, and one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting, and I'm thinking of the moment This is at the start of the novel, where we mentioned briefly that Milena was editing and distributing a journal that, I don't know how you pronounce it, Viboj? Viboj?
Yeah, I have to say my Czech is not very good, so I'm not
Wonderful.
100% sure either.
But and you mentioned that she even uses the help of her young daughter, who's I think 11 by the time this happens in the novel, with the distribution, for example, of
Yeah.
Viboj.
Yeah.
And I think that really demonstrates, right, her dual role as kind of a resistance journalist, but also a mother, and really gets at this whole idea that you just raised of how war situations or how women throughout history in particular have been used for their mind as well as their body. And I think it's just such a powerful moment. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that in a little bit more depth, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was an interesting aspect of her to explore because throughout Milena's life, she was really complicated
Hmm.
and really nuanced, and she was making a lot of mistakes, and she was trying so hard to figure it out. And sometimes she almost did. And that as a character, and a character that I'm trying to draw on the page is so compelling to me. I'm much more interested in characters who are flawed rather than characters who have the same ethics and morals that I do as a 21st century woman. And so Milena, throughout the book, I mean, not just in the way that she approaches motherhood and in the way that she puts people that she loves, perhaps in a situation that she shouldn't have. Not just in that, but like in so many other facets, she's making choices. And, I described this at my book launch. Milena wasn't one to dodge bullets. She was one to run alongside them to see where they went. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like she was like, she couldn't see what was safe before losing her footing. And that's a kind of passion that I think I respect. I respect passion in that sense,
yeah,
where it's like, maybe I'm making a mistake, but this is a mistake worth making
yeah,
in that
yeah,
sense.
yeah,
And so I think that she approached her whole life like that in terms of like the manner in which she married her first husband, the way that she approached her affair with Franz Kafka, the way that she approached her work in terms of her journalism work, the way that she approached her marriage to her second husband, the way that she approached motherhood. And so, like, kind of to your point, women throughout history have been told that we have to do it all and kind of do it with a smile and don't complain and all that sense. So it's like, I kind of think of like, Hollywood might be a poor example, but I think of how on red carpets, we see actresses who are also mothers being
yeah.
asked, well, how do you have it all? How do you do it all? How do you be a mother and an actress? And I remember once Keira Knightley was like, are you going to ask the men all that question? Because nobody's asking George Clooney how he balances fatherhood and being a superstar. You know what I mean? But
Yeah, that's
women are constantly kind of told that we have to, that balance has to be part of our identity. And so I feel like Milena was kind of, I think she probably had a chip on her shoulder about that. And so some questionable choices were made in that sense.
Yeah, but it's a reasonable chip, I guess, to have.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess going off of that in your comments on characterization, because you're basically creating this character, right, out of bits and pieces and fragments. Your entry point into Milena's life is, as she's often remembered, which is Kafka's lover. But she's also, as you alluded to, a journalist, a translator, a resistance fighter, and the list goes on and on. And I'm curious if, in your mind, as you were creating this character, so to speak, from a historical fiction standpoint, if there's some element of her in particular that you really wanted to focus on in the narrative, while at least alluding to the rest, which you do, of course, throughout.
Yeah. I think what I found most compelling about her character was that, she was a Spitfire. You know, especially at a time like 100 years ago, women were starting to, like, the women's movement was slowly starting to find its footing. You know, we're talking about the end of the Great War. And so in many countries, like in the UK and in Canada and in the United States, the suffrage movement is gaining a lot of power. And not just in terms of like women's right to vote, but also like the suffrage movement was also concerned about maybe we should have 8-hour work days. Maybe we shouldn't employ children in factories. You know what I mean? Maybe votes shouldn't just be limited to those who own property. And so things are changing 100 years ago. At the same time, we are still grappling in this time period with, you know, the Victorian age has kind of just died out with the Great War.
Yeah.
And so there's still traces and shadows of it in everyday people's lives. And so for a woman like Milena to be mouthy, to be outspoken, and to basically, you know, say, well, why should the men have all the fun? You know, my husband is off philandering with his mistress. Why don't I go have an affair with Franz Kafka? And I don't care who knows type thing. You know, it's I think it's like, it's so much moxie and so much gumption. And so I feel like a character at that point in time, that to me is interesting, you know, because women were kind of still, despite the women's movement growing at that time period, women were still expected to have their place in society and constantly towing that line of what was appropriate.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that was like, that was a huge draw for me in kind of crafting her character, was to make sure that that Spitfire would come through. And so, you know, I open up the novel, I imagine her interrogation, and I had the interrogator be Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich, who was later known as the Butcher of Prague, and he was, you know, the orchestrator at the Wannsee Conference of the, quote, final solution, unquote, to the Jewish question, which ended up being the massacre of Europe's Jewish population, or Shoah. And, you know, he was famously assassinated on the streets of Prague in 1942. They've actually made a couple Hollywood movies about his assassination, one starring Oscar winner Cillian Murphy. So, you know, it's a big deal, the fact that, you know, I made sure that he was there present in that interrogation, although the historical record doesn't indicate who interrogated her, because I couldn't have like such a huge historical figure like the two of them in Prague at the same time and not have that meeting. Like that had to be there, you know. But I open it up with this awful, horrible man that we know was a complete monster interrogating her, and she's giving him a run for his money. That's the characterization that I wanted. I didn't want it to be that typical thing where it's like, oh, the Germans are here and I'm afraid. It's like, no, she's not like, you're going to give me hell, I'm going to visit it back on you tenfold. And that was really important to me.
Yeah.
To kind of show as a character that she's no wallflower. She's no shrinking violet. And, you know, if you try and pull a fast one, she's going to call you out on it, you know?
Absolutely. And it ties back to that element that you were talking about earlier of a kind of act first, ask questions later type of
because there's consequences to behaving like that with a Gestapo officer, you know what I mean? Like, and she, you know, ultimately suffered the consequences of that. So
yeah, and it's something that you kind of answered tangentially, but that I found really compelling about Letters to Kafka was your balance of historical accuracy with dramatization, right? Where it felt contemporary, as I mentioned earlier, but also firmly rooted in its time in a way that was inevitable to miss, right? And I think that's a really fine balancing act to actually achieve, which is, I think, one of the strengths of the novel itself. And I'm wondering, just from a writing perspective, how you actually manage to think through that process of balance.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite lucky in that there was a lot in the historical record to draw from, and so, you know, when we're talking about the two time periods under which the novel unfolds, which is first the interwar period, and then also the beginning of the Second World War. And so it's really important when building worlds that exist in this time period that you are historically accurate. You have to understand the way that what the streets would have looked like, what the type of people that would have been around. So I was very careful to kind of make a study of society and the politics of the time. At the same time, because we don't have Milena's letters, because we don't know what happened on those two trysts, because her interrogations, with the Nazis, we don't have them in expository detail. I was able to take liberties in that sense, and I could fill in the gaps from the negative space that was left behind. So, for example, if you ever pick up letters to Milena, published in the 1950s, Milena, even though her letters aren't there, her voice is there, though, because you're reading Kafka is responding to her. You can tell that he's responding to an accusation. He's responding to an affection. He's responding to how she's describing her day in Vienna, what life is like on the streets of Vienna post-war, what her husband is doing, what it's like going to the post office every day to send him those goddamn telegrams. Like, you know what I mean? And so if you pay attention to the negative space, a character emerges. And so I was really lucky in that I filled in that negative space and I filled in the gaps. So, but I was very, very concerned with this book not being like some of those historical fiction novels you read where it's supposed to take place in ancient Mesopotamia, but you can totally tell it's written by a 21st century Western author, and they're imbuing too much modern sensibility into it. They haven't done their due diligence and they haven't done their research. I really wanted to, I knew I had to treat this with a lot of care.
Yeah.
And so I was very conscious about making sure that this felt like a document that actually emerged from that time period, that maybe like historians discovered it and it just emerged from 1920, so
which is a very Victorian thing to do, by the way, to come back to the epistolary genre. It's such a
exactly. And so I was an example of that would just understanding that, for example, Vienna, when we think of Vienna today, it's a very cosmopolitan city. It's very ornate, it's very sumptuous. But in 1918, the Great War had just ended. And if you didn't die in the Great War, then the Spanish flu epidemic finished the job. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire has collapsed, causing fuel shortages and coal shortages. And energy supplies have dwindled, and there are bread lines. And inflation is through the roof. And men are coming back from the front with hastily patched up faces and phantom limbs. And respectable women are selling their bodies on the street in order to support their families. Now, this is not the Vienna that we think about when we think of Mozart, we think of Beethoven, we think of the Ringstrasse and the operas and, Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele, but this is not what we think of. And so it was really important for me to build that world. And so, when we are introduced to Vienna in 1918, there's dogs shitting on the street and men doing backdoor deals in alleyways. And, Milena described in her own writing that all of Vienna smelled like sauerkraut.
Yes.
And she says, you go into the soup kitchen and the bread is made with too much yeast, so it rises quickly, and it's black bread. And the soup is made with too much barley and things like that. So it really paints a picture. And that was really important to me. I wanted people to realize that, there were professions and there were people and there were political situations in Vienna that perhaps we don't realize today.
Yeah. I actually had a question on the setting. I had a few questions on setting because it's so crucial to not only just setting the stage as it would, but how you actually introduce characters, right? Yeah. And how you build those characters. And for me, the way that you just described Vienna at the time obviously offers a backdrop to the kind of rotting relationship that she's having with her first husband, right? Yeah. And well, at least that's how I read it. You can maybe disagree with me on that one, but
no, I love that.
And I was wondering how, for you, or why for you that was important as a kind of setup for her then later meeting with Kafka, right? Starting off with this kind of rotting Vienna that rotting is destroyed Vienna is perhaps a better term here than rotting, but before then introducing Kafka, who she will have a very intense and interesting relationship with. Right.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you draw those parallels because it is quite true that while the city around her is a capitulated city, so is, her marriage is quite complicated. I tried to paint the picture, whereas the marriage is not what she had seen when she first agreed to marry her first husband. His name was Ernst Pollock. And so, I think the biggest theme that we deal with when we're talking about drama is appearance versus reality. And so what she thought, the appearance of what her marriage should be, the reality was something different. And that's the same thing with Vienna. It strikes you as like such a cosmopolitan city, but if you know where to go in the right places, you can find a lot of decrepit dilapidation and destitution. And so, yeah, I think there are parallels for sure between the setting in which we find her, where she's dissatisfied with her life. And that is a main theme that I think permeates the novel, not just on her side, but on Kafka's side, because Kafka was, if you've read any of his works, like he had a real issue in terms of like living life versus writing about life.
Yeah.
He was, and that's how their relationship played out, was that in their letters, they have these grand, romantic ideas about what their lives together are going to be like. And then the reality hits of, she lives in Vienna, she's married, even though she's unhappy in her marriage, she's unwilling to leave her husband because she feels like she owes him or something. And Kafka at the same time is like, he lives in Prague. He's been sick his entire life with tuberculosis. He has body issues because he doesn't see how any woman could ever find him attractive because he has faulty lungs. And so his body was never able to kind of grow into with this idea of masculinity that we think about. He also was convinced that him being a Jewish man would not be attractive to her, even though her first husband, Ernst, was a Jewish man. Anti-Semitism was so internalized there, you know what I mean? And so even before the Second World War, anti-Semitism was rife throughout Europe, as it always kind of has been. And so there were a lot of issues, I would say, between the reality of things versus the romanticization of things. And that plays out in the book when we realize that writing life versus living life is very much akin to appearance versus reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is a noted phenomenon, from what I understood. My area of study is not the 19th and 18th century, but of romanticizing illness in really fascinating ways. And you see this in a lot of the literature at the time. So Kafka seems to, and Milena by extension, seem to be engaging in a surprisingly long tradition in that sense. I don't know if you have anything that you wanted to add on that. It's just jumping off of that point. That's what it made me think of, is kind of that surprisingly deep history. Yeah.
I think the only thing I can really think of in terms of that tradition would be how Kafka, in some of his letters to her, he writes how, he wishes that the world was ending tomorrow so that they could just lie down together and die together side by side. So there is a kind of romanticization in terms of mortality in that sense. But I don't know, that's actually an interesting thought. I think I might have to think about that.
Yeah. Okay. It just occurred to me right now as you were saying that. So no expectations on that one. But you mentioned at the start of our discussion that this is a novel that's 12 years in the making at this point. And I'm wondering, seeing the places that you discuss in the novel or that you describe in the novel today, right? How that changed your perspective on some of the places that you were writing about from the perspective of the past, right? I'm trying to connect past to present, of course, in this case, but I'm curious just to what extent. Yeah.
No, that was huge. That was a huge factor. I have to say that had I just done research, in books or in the historical record and not gone beyond that, the book would not be what it is. There were so many discoveries to be made in situ. And it was really important to me. Number one, because we are quite lucky in the fact that both Vienna and Prague suffered very minor structural damage during the Great War and the Second World War. If you think about other cities, like Belgium was completely flattened.
Yeah.
Berlin was completely leveled. And so I lived in Berlin and I lived in Belgium. You very rarely see a pre-war building in Berlin. And if you do see it, it suffered massive structural damage and had to be remodeled, but not Vienna and Prague. They did suffer some damage, but not in a widespread sense. So we're quite lucky in that you can walk the streets of these two cities, and more often than not, you're going to realize this is exactly how it looked 100 years ago, and in some cases 200 years ago.
That's incredible.
So I realized, in all of my trips and I did many trips over the years to Vienna and Prague in order to do my research, that I was looking at things that they looked at. And I visited some of their addresses, their known addresses, and things like that, which were still standing to this day and looked exactly the same. I would say the biggest discovery that I made in situ, which was not available in any historical text that I came across, was Milena's last known address in Prague, where she was arrested by the Gestapo and they hauled her out and she was never seen from again, is in an area of Prague that is quite residential. It's not in the center of Prague. And this is a woman who could have lived anywhere in Prague. And when I visited it, I realized it's literally a 4-minute walk from Kafka's grave in the New Jewish Cemetery. Like, you can literally walk down the street, turn left, and his grave is like right there by the entrance. Yeah. And so he'd been dead for 15 years by the time she lived at this address. So I'm thinking to myself, that was a choice she made. She could have lived anywhere in Prague and she decides to live here. And so that went into the book, that I had to write a scene where she's there visiting his grave, and that is a tradition that she has. And no historical record I came across, no book, no biography, none of the people I interviewed, none of the museums I went to, none of the census records or voter roll, nothing that was not mentioned. And I just find that so striking. Yeah. And so I think one of the great things about writing this book is that I remember this quite clearly. I was about 150 pages in and I had hit a wall. Like, my creativity, I was just like, it just wasn't there. And so I went back to Vienna and Prague for about a month over the Christmas and New Year's holidays. Okay. And when I came back, my manuscript within a couple months went from 150 pages to 400. It was so invigorating just being back on the streets. Wow. Like, within 2 months, I had more than doubled my manuscript. Just because I remember when my editor and I were going over the book just earlier this year, she was like, Chris, you need to get this under 100,000 words. Yeah. And I'm like, I have so much to say. So it's difficult because you're so inspired by a place and the place can really inform the work as it did in my book. Yeah. That was super important to the work and to the research and to the crafting of the story.
That's so awesome. And the grave, the inclusion of the grave is something that's really interesting, right? Because it's so symbolic of also the, I guess, undercurrent that you're going for thematically throughout, where Kafka is present, but also not overshadowing, right? If I'm not mistaken, and I'm trying to remember here, the first time we mention him is at the grave, right? Is when she visits him, or that's so, we start off the narrative and he's dead already, right? And it kind of, I guess,
it's
signals.
The weird thing about writing historical fiction is that how this is going to end. We know how Kafka died, we know how Milena died, and so I don't think it's a big ask to ask readers to go on that journey knowing how it ends, but at the same time, it presented challenges to crafting the narrative that perhaps other historical fiction novels don't have, or just not even historical fiction, but just regular novels don't have, where you don't know how it's going to end. And this one, he dies, and he dies young. Yeah,
but it's this can become a whole discussion on structuralism at this point, and the structure of novels. But you do kind of expect anything. You always have certain expectations about stories. The important part is the journey, right? This is not a new take in and of itself.
Sure.
But
It's not
it
the
is,
destination, it's the journey.
yeah, right. But I think you're right in pointing to its particular relevance to historical fiction, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So absolutely. Another thing that I wanted to raise as far as relations to the present is something that you mentioned a few times so far, and it's the fact that Milena was so politically engaged, right? As an anti-fascist, as someone who was an outspoken communist, right, through in her life, and a journalist, again, all of this. And I'm wondering if this was ever something that you actively considered while writing, is how this would translate to contemporary political sensibilities. Because yes, there are parallels to be had today, of course, but it's still not quite the same thing, right, that she would have gone through. And there are a few things that people have more difficulty with, I think, than translating politics from one time to another. And I'm wondering how you kind of engaged with that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was definitely a big concern of mine and something that came up a lot in the process of this, because yeah, like I mentioned earlier, like I am a 21st century Western woman, and my ethics and morals are, they emerge from the period in which I've emerged. And Milena was born over 100 years ago, so her ethics and morals, in some places they will align, but in many places they will not. And I think we find that a lot in the way that someone asked me at a literary festival I did a couple weeks ago if I saw Milena as a feminist. And I was like, I see her as a bad feminist, because while she was engaged with the idea of like, I'm going to work and this is my passion, not, my marriage or being a mother, I am going to, make my mark in that way and seek my own fate. And why should the men have all the fun? I'm going to have the same kind of fun that they do. At the same time, she wasn't what I would call a girl's girl. You know what I mean? I think that she saw her own liberties and her own passions as her own, and how dare another woman get in her way. And she would step over another woman to get what she wanted, in that sense. So there's a very, try not to spoil this, but we know from the historical record that Kafka was famously engaged 3 times, but never married. And in fact, he was engaged twice to the same woman.
Yeah.
And one of those women, her name was Julie. Well, that's a German pronunciation. I guess in English we'd say Julie. And, Milena's carrying on with Kafka while he's engaged to Julie, And so Julie finds out about it. And we know from the historical record that she wrote to Milena and was, we don't know exactly what she said, but we know that she was none too pleased and shared her opinion of Milena for doing this. And so I imagined Milena responding to her, and her response is quite scathing, and I will not reveal it here because I want people to read it, but
yeah, of course,
it's basically like a mic drop, it's like a rap battle where she's like, boom, motherfucker. You know what I mean? It's like, it's awful, because today, my feminism is very much rooted in uplifting other women, and, not seeing another woman as competition, but rather seeing the sisterhood that we have. Milena was not like that. And so you do have to grapple sometimes with issues like that, where the character, your protagonist, can be awful at sometimes. But I have to say, and I know I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, as an author and also as a reader, I am super not interested in reading characters that are exactly like me.
No.
This is why I think a book like Yellowface is so fantastic, because have you read Yellowface?
I have. It's wonderful.
Every single character we meet in Yellowface is awful.
Yeah,
they're
deplorable.
horrible. And I'm just like, I can't put this book down. It's fantastic. Like, I just like, and somehow, even though they're awful, you find yourself agreeing with characters, rooting for characters, wanting them to figure it out. And it's the brilliance of that book, I think. And that is what I'm interested in as well. So no shade to people who are like, they love like a good Colleen Hoover book or whatever. Like
Sure.
if
Yeah.
like whatever gets you excited about literature, that's
Yeah.
fine, but I'm never going to write a Colleen Hoover book. You know what I mean? I'm not
Yeah.
interested in that. I want to write characters that are provocative and that are challenging and that are complicated and making mistakes. That's what I'm interested in. And as a reader, that's what I'm interested in.
Absolutely. To put it in like a single sentence, it's the flaws that make them attractive, right?
Yeah.
Like even if we're not aware of it, right, we like to see our flaws, so to speak, being lived through by others, even if it's not like a one-to-one type of thing, but just the fact that other people have flaws is oddly satisfying.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
So
Totally. I mean,
100%.
that's what, I mean, as we know, the essence of drama is conflict. If you don't have conflict, you don't have a novel. And so if everybody is just like, you know, the paragon and this beacon of light, and we can take our cues on them, our cues on integrity from them, then what's the point of reading?
Exactly. Yeah. I was, when you were calling Milena a bad feminist, it struck me that there was this big debate, especially around the 1920s when some of the novel takes place, right? Of especially women who were involved in socialist circles like Milena would have been, right? I'm thinking of people like Rosa Luxemburg, who...
Yeah, love her. Love her.
But there's some really interesting parallels, right, for listeners who might want a historical parallel to this with Luxemburg, who didn't really consider herself, right, a suffragist as far as I remember, right? Because for her, it was first and foremost a question of workers' rights and social rights that would elevate everyone, including women, right, to something greater, right? So I think it's again, it's just something that I thought of off the top of my head as you were thinking, but it's something I think that helps me understand Milena as a complex figure in that sense, as you were talking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you have to give your characters the space and the opportunity to try and figure it out. You know,
Exactly.
they're figuring it out just the same way. Like I have to say, you know, I'm on the wrong side of 40 now, but when I was 20 years ago in my 20s, I was probably a bad feminist as well. I think I made terrible mistakes when it came to my relationships with women in my life. And you look back and you just realize I can learn from this and I can grow from this. And you know, Rosa Luxemburg, Milena, Emmeline Pankhurst, a lot of the women around that era, I think they made mistakes where now we would see them as not part of the feminism that we want to have today. But you got to give them that space to make those mistakes.
Of course. Yeah. I have two last questions as we wrap up, right? And one of them is on the writing itself. So we talked about your engagement in writing, and I'm wondering, as well as Milena's, and I'm wondering how much you tried to, I guess, shape the narrative itself based off of Milena's writing style herself, because there are some of her writings that do remain, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much of her historical, or her historically available, I should say, writing and archived writing was infused into the book itself, right? How you kind of manage that, because you still create a unique voice for the novel. Right?
Yeah, well, I think because we do have quite a bit of her essays and op-eds and editorials and dispatches from post-war Vienna, those are still available and they've been translated. We do kind of get an idea of not only what she was passionate about and what she was concerning herself with, but how she might have been as a friend, as a correspondence, you know, in letters, how she might have been as a wife, how she might have been as a lover. And so I did a lot of extrapolating in that sense. So a lot of the things that she actually wrote about, they found their way into the dialogue. They found their way into some of the letters that she sends to Kafka. And that was really helpful in terms of trying to paint the whole picture as much as one can, you know, of a figure who's been dead for 80 years. I think, we're really lucky in that we do have those dispatches, because you get a sense of, you know, she was writing about a lot of things that when you realize in parallel with the personal life that she was leading, why she was interested in them. So for example, some of her early dispatches, so she was writing about what post-war Vienna was like for Czech magazines and periodicals. And some of her early essays are about fashion and about how the skirts are getting shorter and so are the haircuts, and the nights are getting longer and the booze is flowing and there's jazz everywhere. And this is what the colors that pop and the hemlines that we like and the waistlines that we like. And why is she interested in this? Because, you know, her husband is carrying on with his mistress and he's not sharing his wages with her. And she's walking around wearing old fashion because she can't afford the new stuff. And she kind of has this as was described at the time, an erotic crisis because she wasn't seen as attractive to her husband. And so in the book, we kind of explore how she goes about remedying that. No spoilers. But yeah, it's interesting to me that as a woman who, you know, she had to port valises and suitcases at the Westbahnhof train station in order to make ends meet, is concerned about the nice, you know, Bemberg fabrics and damask wallpaper and, you know, brogue shoes. Like, she's concerned about this. It's probably because it was inspirational, it was aspirational. She wanted the finer things in life, and she felt like she belonged in that class system and that caste system, and she was sort of excluded from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
The last question that I always ask is, I guess, journalism 101. What didn't I ask in this interview? What's the answer to that question?
Oh, what didn't you ask? What didn't you ask? Well, there is one thing that I always like to talk about, which is people love to talk about the creativity behind writing a novel or any sort of creative work, but people rarely are engaged with the business side of it, in that talent is always going to be your number one asset. I stand by that, but you need drive, you need ambition, you need patience, because the literary industry, the publishing industry, is notoriously slow. You know, I got this book deal 2 years ago and the book is only out now, you know, and I've been writing this book for 12 years. So I feel like there is sometimes a disconnect between the creativity of our industry and the business of our industry. And I think the one thing I want people to know is that this book faced a lot of rejection, a lot of hurdles that I didn't know I was going to have to jump over in order to get this book out there. And if I had paid attention to the rejection, I never would have gotten anywhere. It was because, like Milena, I was tenacious and I had the audacity to believe that my voice deserved to be out there and to be published, that the book is here today. So I just want people to know that don't let rejection hold you back. Let it propel you forward.
Yeah. It ended up with House of Anansi, right? So one of the major publishers of, I guess, premier books, you would call it in Canada. It's incredible.
Quite lucky. They're a fantastic house. I always, I remember in my 20s trying to, like, writing manuscripts and trying to get a book deal and it not working out, saying to my agent, like, oh man, I would give my left tit to be with House of Anansi. You know what I mean? Because I just loved all their books. You know, they have Patrick DeWitt. And, I was just like, I was just so in love with their roster. And, you know, to be with them now, to have both of my books published with them is just, it's just a joy and a delight.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Christine, I can't thank you enough for the time that you gave me today. It's been really a pleasure listening to you talk about Letters to Kafka. And obviously, I'll be putting links to where people can find it in the description to this episode. But is there anything that you want to plug as far as, like, social media or anything like that you're interested in?
Sure. I mean, I'm mainly active on Instagram, so you can find me on there. My username is just my first initial C and my last name Estima, so C Estima. And please connect with me. I would love it if anybody who has picked up the book or read it, please share your thoughts. I'm so excited to connect with readers, and I'm going to be appearing in October at the Vancouver Writers Fest and in November at the Toronto International Festival of Authors. And the book has been chosen for the Festival of Authors virtual book club. So if you'd like to join a book club and discuss the book with me, I'll be appearing virtually there. Please do. I'd love to speak with anybody who's picked up the book.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And I look forward to whatever else comes out of your imagination.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.